The vast expanse of the western frontier stretched before the wagon train, like an endless sea of grass and possibility. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of camp, her thin frame silhouetted against the setting sun as she struggled to lift a wooden bucket of water. Her hands, once soft and unblemished, now bore the calluses and cuts of 3 months on the Oregon Trail. The wagon master's critical gaze followed her every move, his judgment clear in the hard set of his jaw. "That girl won't last another week," he muttered to the circle of men gathered around the evening fire. "She's slowing us down, and winter's coming faster than we can outrun it." Sarah pretended not to hear as she carefully made her way back to her wagon, the smallest in the train, and now traveling alone since her father's passing 2 weeks prior. The fever had taken him quickly, leaving her with nothing but his dreams of a new life in Oregon and a wagon full of belongings she could barely manage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning brought frost that crunched beneath Sarah's worn boots as she hitched her oxen with trembling fingers. The animals sensed her uncertainty, growing restless as she fumbled with the harnesses. "Need help there, Miss Mitchell?" James Cooper, a burly farmer traveling with his sons, approached with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I can manage, thank you," Sarah replied, straightening her back despite the exhaustion weighing on her limbs. She'd overheard the whispers, how the men had drawn straws to decide who would offer to marry her, saving her from being left behind while conveniently acquiring her father's wagon and supplies. The wagon master's whistle pierced the dawn air, signaling departure. Sarah climbed onto her seat, taking the reins with a determination that belied her fear. They had entered the foothills of the mountains, and the trail ahead grew steeper with each passing day. By midday, disaster struck. Her wagon wheel caught in a deep rut, the oxen straining against the sudden resistance. A sickening crack echoed through the air as the axles splintered under the pressure. The wagon train halted, an accordion of canvas and wood folding to a stop behind her. The wagon master approached, his expression thunderous. "That's it, Miss Mitchell. We've carried you as far as we can. Winter's breathing down our necks, and we can't spare the time for repairs." "I can fix it," Sarah insisted, already assessing the damage. "My father taught me how—" "Your father isn't here," he cut her off coldly, "and we've got 20 other families who'll die in the mountain snow if we don't make it through the pass." In the next 3 weeks, the verdict came swiftly. They would leave at first light, continuing without her. They'd spare what supplies they could, flour, salt, ammunition for the small pistol her father had insisted she learn to use. James Cooper offered one last time to save her through marriage, his eyes appraising her father's possessions more than her face. Sarah refused, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. As darkness fell, she sat alone by her small fire, the abandoned wagon casting long shadows across the empty campsite. The wagon train had moved half a mile upstream to make camp away from her, as if misfortune might be contagious. A sound from the darkness made her reach for her father's pistol. She held it steady, pointing toward the rustling grasses at the edge of her firelight. "I mean no harm," came a deep voice, followed by the emergence of a man unlike any she had seen before. He moved with the silent grace of a predator, yet his eyes held a quiet wisdom that stilled her finger on the trigger. His skin was burnished copper in the firelight, his long black hair braided with small wooden beads that clicked softly as he approached. "I am Dakota of the Cherokee," he said in perfect, if accented, English. "I scout for the army at Fort Laramie." His eyes took in the broken wagon, the meager supplies, and finally Sarah herself. But unlike the wagon master, his gaze held no judgment, only curiosity. "They left you behind," he stated simply. "They will return for me once they secure passage through the mountains," Sarah lied, pride keeping her voice from cracking. The corner of Dakota's mouth lifted slightly. "The mountains will be buried in snow before they could return." even if that was their intention. Sarah's shoulders slumped, the weight of her situation finally breaking through her resolve. They said I was too weak to continue, that I would slow them down and risk everyone's lives. Dakota remained silent for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames between them. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen more of the world's truths than most. The white man's measure of strength is narrow, he said quietly. They see only what can be lifted, what can be broken. His eyes met hers across the fire. They do not see what can be endured. A strange calm settled over Sarah as she held his gaze. For the first time since her father's death, she felt seen, not as a burden or a problem to be solved, but as a person standing at a crossroads. "What will you do now, Sarah Mitchell?" Dakota asked, somehow knowing her name without being told. Sarah looked at the broken wagon that held everything she owned in this world. Tomorrow, she would be truly alone in a wilderness that had already claimed countless lives. Logic told her to beg the wagon train to reconsider, to accept James Cooper's loveless proposal, to surrender to the verdict that she was too weak to survive on her own. Instead, she felt something crystallize within her, a hardness forming around the soft core of her fear. "I'm going to continue west," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "My father died, believing we would make a new life in Oregon. I won't let his dream die with him." Dakota studied her for a long moment, then nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. The pass they seek will indeed be treacherous with their heavy wagons, but there is another way through the mountains, a path known to my people for generations. Would you show me this path?" Sarah asked, hope flaring for the first time in days. Dakota's expression remained impassive. "It is not a path for wagons, or those the white men consider strong. It requires different strengths, endurance, patience, and the wisdom to listen to the mountain rather than fight against it." "I can learn," Sarah said, her chin lifting. "I've been learning since the day we left Independence." "We shall see," Dakota replied, his voice neither promising nor dismissing. "Rest now. Tomorrow will test what kind of strength truly matters on this journey." As Sarah settled into her bedroll that night, she realized the Cherokee scout had not actually agreed to help her. Yet somehow, his presence and his words had shifted something fundamental in how she viewed herself and the impossible task ahead. The wagon train would continue without her, carrying with it the judgment that she was too weak to survive. But as sleep finally claimed her, Sarah felt the first stirrings of a different kind of strength taking root, one that might prove them all wrong. Dawn broke with merciless clarity, revealing the wagon train already disappearing into the distance. Sarah watched the last canvas-topped wagon crest a hill and vanish from sight. No backward glances, no hesitation. She was now merely a footnote in their journey, the weak girl they'd had to leave behind. Dakota materialized from the morning mist like a spirit, startling Sarah as she inventoried what remained of her supplies. "You have decided then?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Yes." Sarah tightened the straps on her father's old rucksack. "But I can't leave everything behind. Some of this belonged to my mother." Dakota knelt beside the broken wagon, examining the fractured axle with expert hands. "The wagon cannot be mended quickly enough to matter. You must choose what your back can carry and what your heart can leave behind." His words cut through her like steel. Sarah climbed into the wagon one last time, fingers tracing familiar objects, her mother's china teacup, her father's books, the heavy wool blankets that had kept them warm across the plains. She emerged with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, seeds for planting, her mother's wedding band, her father's journal, and a small pouch of gold coins sewn into the lining of her coat. Everything else, the physical remnants of her former life, she covered with the wagon's canvas, offering a silent prayer that perhaps someday she might return. "How will they survive the winter?" Sarah asked, nodding toward the distant wagon train. "Some will not," Dakota answered without sentiment. "The pass they seek has already seen early snow. Their wagons are heavy, their animals tired." He shouldered her pack alongside his own. "Come, our path lies there." He pointed toward a rocky ridge that appeared impassable. The first day nearly broke her. Dakota set a pace that seemed cruel, climbing steadily upward through terrain Sarah would have deemed impossible for travel. By midday, her legs trembled with each step, her lungs burning in the thinning air. "I need to rest," she finally gasped. Collapsing onto a sun-warmed rock, Dakota stopped but didn't set down his burden. The wagon master was right about one thing. Winter comes quickly to these mountains. Each day spent is one we cannot reclaim. "Then leave me," Sarah snapped, frustration boiling over. "Everyone else has." Dakota's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I have not yet decided if you are worth guiding, Sarah Mitchell. Show me why I should continue." The challenge in his words rekindled something in her. Sarah forced herself to her feet, ignoring the screaming protest of her muscles. "Then let's continue. I won't be the one to turn back." They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow beneath an outcropping of rock. Sarah's hands shook so badly she could barely strike the flint for fire. Without comment, Dakota took over the task, his movements efficient and practiced. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah finally asked, as they shared a meager supper of jerky and dried berries. Dakota was silent for so long, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. "My people were forced from their homeland years ago. Thousands walked the trail of tears to unfamiliar territory." His voice carried no bitterness, only a profound solemnity. "I saw elders and children alike abandoned when they could not keep pace. The strong survived by abandoning the weak." He met her gaze across the small fire. "I swore I would never measure strength by such standards again." "And what standards do you use?" Sarah asked. "I watch. I wait. I see if there is fire inside when the body fails." His eyes assessed her with penetrating intensity. "Tomorrow will reveal more of what burns within you." Dawn brought a stinging sleet that pelted them mercilessly as they continued upward. Sarah's world narrowed to the simple act of placing one foot before the other, following Dakota's sure steps through terrain that seemed to grow more treacherous by the hour. By midday, they reached a narrow ledge, barely wide enough for a single person to traverse. Below, a dizzying drop of hundreds of feet ended in jagged rocks and a rushing mountain stream. "We must cross," Dakota stated simply, stepping onto the ledge without hesitation. Sarah froze, terror gripping her throat. "I can't." "Then you have. Come as far as you will go," Dakota replied, continuing forward without looking back. Sarah watched him move with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, disappearing around a bend in the rock face. Alone again. Abandoned again. The sleet intensified, driven horizontal by gusting wind that threatened to tear her from the mountainside. The path back was no safer than the path forward, and night in this exposed position would mean certain death. Sarah closed her eyes, drawing a deep breath that tasted of ice and fear. Then she opened them, fixed her gaze on the rock wall beside her, and stepped onto the ledge. Each inch was a victory against the void below. Her fingers sought desperate purchase on the slick stone. Her body pressed so tightly against the mountain that she could feel its cold seeping into her bones. Around the bend, the ledge narrowed further. A section had crumbled away, leaving a gap of perhaps 2 feet, an impossible distance with nothing below but death. Sarah's courage faltered, a sob catching in her throat. "You see only the gap, not the crossing." Dakota's voice came from beyond the break. He had waited for her after all. "I can't jump that," Sarah called, her voice whipped away by the wind. "Then you will stay there until you fall," he answered calmly, "or until you see with different eyes." Sarah scanned the rock face desperately. Above the gap, a small, twisted pine had somehow taken root in the mountain's unyielding surface. Its branches stretched outward, gnarled and weathered by countless storms. Understanding dawned. Sarah removed her belt, fashioning a loop that she tossed upward toward the tree. 3 attempts failed before the leather finally caught on a sturdy branch. She tested the belt with a sharp tug, then another. It held. Sarah took a deep breath, gripped the makeshift handhold with both hands, and swung herself across the gap. Her feet found purchase on the far side, her momentum carrying her into Dakota, who steadied her with strong hands. "Now you begin." "To see," he said, something like approval warming his voice for the first time. They made camp that night in a small cave, sheltered from the worsening storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The wagon train would have reached the pass by now," Sarah said, watching the snow accumulate. "At the cave's mouth?" "Yes," Dakota confirmed, "and found it impossible to cross. They will be forced to make winter camp in the valley below and pray their supplies last until spring." "They'll be trapped?" The realization struck Sarah with unexpected force. "All those families, those children, it is the path they chose," Dakota replied, "just as you have chosen yours." Sarah stared into the small fire, thoughts turning to James Cooper and his reluctant proposal, to the wagon master's dismissal of her strength, to the families who had shared their journey for months before abandoning her to fate. "I don't wish them harm," she said finally. Dakota studied her face in the flickering light. "That," he said quietly, "is yet another kind of strength the wagon master would not understand." As sleep claimed her that night, Sarah realized she had covered more difficult terrain in one day than the wagon train would manage in a week. Her body ached in ways she never imagined possible, but something else had awakened within her, a certainty that perhaps she wasn't so weak after all. Morning broke with silence so profound, Sarah could hear the crystalline sound of snowflakes settling outside their shelter. During the night, nearly a foot of snow had transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The realization of what this meant for their journey settled in her stomach like a stone. "We cannot continue in this," she said, watching Dakota methodically check his supplies. "We cannot stay," he countered. "This cave offers shelter from wind, but not from hunger. Our supplies will last 3 days at most. But the snow, guys, why we must move now, before more falls." Dakota extinguished their small fire with a handful of snow. "The path, I know, lies beneath this blanket of white. Each hour, it grows more difficult to find." Sarah's muscles screamed in protest as she shouldered her pack. Every movement awakened fresh pain from yesterday's ordeal. She bit her lip to keep from voicing complaint, remembering the wagon master's dismissal. Outside, the world had been transformed. What had been a narrow mountain path was now an unbroken field of white, sloping dangerously toward the precipice they had navigated yesterday. "How will you find the trail?" Sarah asked, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Dakota pointed to subtle features in the landscape, the way certain trees bent away from prevailing winds, the shape of rocks protruding through the snow, the barely perceptible line where the path cut through the mountainside. "These mountains speak to those who know how to listen," he said. "Your people try to conquer the land. Mine learned to read it." Their progress was agonizingly slow. Each step required careful consideration, testing the snow for treacherous depths or hidden crevices. By midday, they had covered perhaps 2 miles, and Sarah's legs felt leaden with exhaustion. Dakota stopped abruptly, raising his hand for silence. Sarah froze, straining to hear what had alerted him. At first, she caught only the soft whisper of wind through pine boughs. Then a faint cry carried on the mountain air. "Someone's out there," she whispered. Dakota nodded, his expression grave. The sound came from below, near where your wagon train would have made camp. Without discussion, they altered their course, descending carefully toward the source of the distress. The snow grew deeper as they lost elevation, in some places reaching Sarah's knees. After an hour of difficult travel, they emerged from a stand of pines to a devastating sight. 3 wagons lay overturned at the bottom of a steep ravine, their canvas coverings torn and flapping in the wind like broken wings. Scattered around them were crates and barrels, supplies that had broken free during what must have been a catastrophic descent. "The wagon master pushed them too hard," Dakota said, scanning the wreckage. "They tried to force the pass despite the snow." Sarah's heart constricted as she searched for signs of life among the destruction. "We have to help them." Dakota didn't respond immediately, his eyes tracking something Sarah couldn't see. Then he moved with sudden purpose toward a partially collapsed wagon. Sarah followed, stumbling through the deep snow in his wake. A faint sound emerged from beneath the splintered wood, a child's cry, weakening even as they approached. Dakota tore at the debris with methodical strength, Sarah working alongside him despite her exhaustion. They uncovered a small space where the wagon's frame had created a protective pocket. Huddled inside were 2 children, a boy of perhaps 8 and a girl no more than 5. Between them lay a woman deathly pale, a deep gash visible across her forehead. "Mrs. Cooper," Sarah gasped, recognizing the wife of the man who had offered to marry her. The woman's eyes fluttered at the sound. "Of her name, Miss Mitchell," she whispered, disbelief coloring her voice. "How—" "Save your strength," Sarah urged, already assessing the woman's injuries. "We'll get you out of there." The boy, Sarah remembered him as Samuel, looked up with hollow eyes. "Pa went for help. Said he'd be back by nightfall yesterday." Dakota and Sarah exchanged glances. If James Cooper had tried to reach the main wagon train during yesterday's storm, "We'll find him," Sarah promised, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "First, let's get your mother and sister somewhere safe." With careful movements, they extracted the family from the wreckage. Mrs. Cooper couldn't stand, her leg bent at an unnatural angle. Sarah fashioned a travois from broken wagon parts and blankets, while Dakota scouted the area for other survivors. He returned as she finished securing Mrs. Cooper to the makeshift stretcher. "The other wagons are empty. Their occupants either walked away or were taken by others." His expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "There is a suitable cave 1/2 a mile from here. We can shelter there until the woman is stable enough to move." "And Mr. Cooper?" Sarah asked quietly, ensuring the children couldn't hear. Dakota's eyes flickered to the mountainside above them. "I will search for him once you are safely housed." The cave proved better than Sarah had dared hope, deep enough to provide shelter from the wind, with a natural chimney that would allow them to build a fire without suffocation. While Dakota departed to hunt for James Cooper, Sarah set about making the injured woman and children as comfortable as possible. Mrs. Cooper drifted in and out of consciousness as Sarah cleaned and bound her wounds. The broken leg would require more skilled attention than Sarah could provide, but she set it as best she could, using strips of wagon canvas to immobilize it. "Why?" Mrs. Cooper asked during a moment of clarity, her eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "Why help us after what James said to you? After we left you behind?" Sarah dipped a cloth in melted snow, gently bathing the woman's feverish forehead. "Would you have me leave your children to freeze? Is that what you believe me capable of?" Shame clouded the woman's features. "The wagon master said we had no choice, that helping you meant dooming us all." "And yet here I am, alive," Sarah replied without bitterness. "While your wagon train—" She let the words trail off, unwilling to voice the likelihood that many more had perished in the ill-advised crossing attempt. Little Emma Cooper, the 5-year-old girl, crept closer to Sarah as darkness fell, her small body trembling with cold and fear. "Will Papa find us?" she whispered. Sarah gathered the child into her arms, sharing her warmth. "Your father is very strong," she said, choosing her words carefully, "and clever too. He'll do everything he can to return to you." Samuel stood guard at the cave entrance, his young face set in an expression too old for his years. "The wagon. Master said the mountains would kill anyone who wasn't strong enough," he said flatly. "He said women and children should listen to men who know better." Sarah joined him at the entrance, watching snow continue to fall in the gathering darkness. "Strength comes in many forms, Samuel. Sometimes it looks like endurance rather than force. Sometimes it's knowing when to change your path rather than forcing your way forward." The boy considered this, his eyes tracking the endless descent of snowflakes. "Is that why you're not dead? Because you found a different kind of strength?" "I found a different kind of guide," Sarah corrected gently. "Someone who measures worth by what's inside rather than what shows on the surface." Night had fully descended when Dakota returned, his entrance preceded by a blast of cold air that made the small fire dance wildly. His expression told Sarah everything before he spoke a word. "I found tracks leading up toward the pass," he said quietly. "They ended at a cliff edge. There were signs of a fall." Sarah closed her eyes, absorbing the impact of his words. James Cooper, arrogant, condescending, but ultimately a father trying to save his family, had perished in the same wilderness that had been meant to claim her. "Did you?" She couldn't finish the question. "There was no body to recover," Dakota replied. "The snow has claimed him for now. Perhaps spring will reveal more." How to tell the children? How to explain to a 5-year-old girl that her father would never return? Sarah felt the weight of this new responsibility settling across her shoulders, heavier than any pack she had carried up the mountainside. Mrs. Cooper must have read the truth in their expressions. A low moan escaped her lips, quickly stifled, when she glanced toward her sleeping children. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Dakota crouched beside the fire, feeding it precious sticks of kindling. "The storm will worsen before it breaks. We cannot move until your leg begins to heal and the snow lessens." "And then?" Sarah pressed, needing to hear some plan, some path forward through this tragedy. Dakota's dark eyes reflected the dancing, flames as he looked from Sarah to the injured woman and the sleeping children. "Then we continue west," he said simply, "all of us." In that moment, Sarah recognized that their journey had fundamentally changed. She was no longer merely struggling to prove her own worth against those who had abandoned her. Now, she carried responsibility for others who had once deemed her too weak to merit saving. The irony wasn't lost on her, but there was no satisfaction in it, only grim determination to prove that her kind of strength, the kind that endured rather than dominated, might be exactly what was needed to survive the winter that now held them all in its merciless grip. 2 weeks passed in the mountain cave, each day marked by the struggle to survive as winter tightened its grip. The snow continued to fall intermittently, building drifts that sometimes reached the cave entrance, requiring constant clearing to prevent them from becoming entombed. Sarah developed a rhythm to their precarious existence, mornings spent gathering and melting snow for water, midday dedicated to rebinding Mrs. Cooper's leg and teaching the children to identify edible plants and roots that Dakota showed them growing beneath the snow. Evenings spent conserving their dwindling supplies while telling stories around the fire to keep despair at bay. Dakota came and went like a shadow, disappearing for hours to hunt with a bow he had fashioned from a flexible pine branch. He rarely returned empty-handed, though his catches grew leaner as game became scarcer with the deepening winter. "How much longer before we can travel?" Sarah asked him one evening, as they skinned a rabbit safely out of earshot of the children. "The woman's leg mends slowly," Dakota replied, his hands never pausing in their work, "and the winter has only begun its true assault on these mountains. We can't stay here indefinitely. Our supplies are not my greatest concern." Dakota's eyes flicked toward the cave. The boy grows restless. He wants to search for his father. Sarah's hands stilled. "You told me there was no hope." "There isn't. But grief makes men reckless, even young ones." That night, Sarah woke to find Samuel gone, his bedroll empty beside his sleeping sister. Panic surged through her as she scrambled to her feet, careful not to wake Mrs. Cooper, whose fever had finally broken just days earlier. Outside, the night was clear and brutally cold, stars burning with fierce brilliance in the black sky. Fresh tracks in the snow led away from the cave, up toward the pass where James Cooper had last been seen. Sarah didn't hesitate. She pulled on her coat and followed, her breath forming crystalline clouds before her face. The boy couldn't have gotten far. His tracks were still sharp-edged, not yet softened by wind-blown snow. She found him a quarter-mile up the trail, a small figure hunched against a boulder, shivering violently in the merciless cold. "Samuel," she called softly, approaching slowly as if he were a spooked animal that might bolt. The boy's tear-streaked face lifted toward her, his features blue-tinged in the moonlight. "He might still be alive," he said, his voice cracking. "The wagon master always said Pa was the strongest man in the train." Sarah knelt beside him, ignoring the bite of snow through her worn trousers. "Being strong doesn't make someone invincible, Samuel. Your father was brave and determined, but the mountain doesn't care about courage. Then what's the point?" Samuel's voice cracked with anger and grief. "If being strong doesn't matter, what does?" Sarah pulled the boy close, sharing her warmth, as his small body trembled against hers. "Strength kept your father alive, long enough to find shelter for your mother and sister after the accident. It got him up this mountain in a blizzard trying to save you all." She tilted his face up to meet her eyes. "But it's a different kind of strength that will keep you alive now. The strength to accept what's happened and to protect what remains of your family." Samuel's face crumpled, the last defense of artificial manhood falling away. He buried his face against Sarah's shoulder, his sobs muffled by her coat. "I don't know how to be the man of the family," he whispered, when his tears finally subsided. "I don't know how to save us, neither do I," Sarah admitted, "but together we might figure it out." They made their way back to the cave, the cold driving them forward when grief might have anchored them in place. Dakota waited at the entrance, his face expressionless, though Sarah could read relief in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "The tiresome boy needed to understand," he said later, after Samuel had fallen into exhausted sleep beside his sister. "Some lessons cannot be taught with words." "You knew he would go?" Sarah asked, disbelief coloring her tone. "I followed him. I would not have let harm come to him." Dakota stoked the fire with deliberate movements. "But he needed to feel the mountain's power for himself, to understand what his father faced. He's just a child. Children become adults quickly in these mountains." Dakota's eyes met hers. "As you have discovered yourself." The next morning brought a rare break in the weather, a day of brilliant sunshine that transformed the threatening landscape into something approaching beauty. Sarah stood at the cave entrance, evaluating the glistening world outside with new eyes. "We should gather as much wood as possible," she said to Dakota. "The clear weather won't last." He nodded approvingly. "You begin to think like one who expects to survive." They spent the day in productive labor. Dakota showed Samuel how to identify and dig up roots that had sustained his people through countless winters. Sarah taught Emma to weave pine needles into crude baskets for gathering. Mrs. Cooper now able to sit upright and move with the aid of a crutch Dakota had fashioned, sorted their remaining supplies with ruthless efficiency. "We have perhaps 10 days of flour," she announced that evening as they gathered around the fire. "Longer if we stretch it further." "The hunting grows more difficult," Dakota added. "The animals have moved to lower elevations." "Then perhaps we should as well," Sarah suggested, the idea forming even as she spoke. "Not all the way to the valley, but lower than this cave." Dakota considered, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "There is a place, a series of natural shelters where my people sometimes wintered. 2 days' journey from here, but lower on the mountain's shoulder." "Can Mrs. Cooper make such a journey?" Sarah asked. "With help," the woman interjected, her face set with determination. "I won't be the one to endanger us all by staying where we cannot survive." The irony of her words hung unspoken between them. Once it had been Sarah who was deemed too weak to merit saving. Now their roles had reversed in ways none could have imagined. They spent 2 days preparing, fashioning a sturdier travois for Mrs. Cooper, smoking what little meat remained from Dakota's last successful hunt, gathering every useful item from the wreckage of the Cooper wagon. On the 3rd morning, they set out as the first light of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Sarah led Emma by the hand, while Samuel walked proudly at Dakota's side, carrying a pack nearly half his size without complaint. The journey proved more arduous than any had anticipated. What had been a 2-day trek for Dakota alone stretched into 4 grueling days of careful navigation through deep snow, pausing frequently to rest Mrs. Cooper, whose stoic face couldn't completely mask her pain. By sunset of the 4th day, even, Sarah's determination began to flag. The children walked in silence, exhaustion having stolen their voices. Mrs. Cooper had fallen into a feverish half-sleep on the travois. Only Dakota moved with the same measured stride as when they'd begun, though Sarah noted the deepening lines etched around his eyes. "We must reach shelter before nightfall," he said, his voice carrying an urgency she hadn't heard before. "A storm approaches." Sarah looked up to see dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, moving with unnatural speed toward their position. The temperature was already dropping, the earlier glow of exertion fading from her limbs. "How much further?" she asked, gathering Emma into her arms as the child stumbled yet again. "Too far for our current pace," Dakota admitted. His eyes met hers, and for the first time Sarah saw genuine concern in their depths. "I must go ahead and return for you." "No!" The word escaped her with unexpected force. "We stay together. The storm will claim us all if we do not find proper shelter. Then we make shelter here," Sarah insisted, scanning their surroundings with desperate intensity. They stood in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines whose branches drooped under the weight of snow. Understanding dawned like a physical sensation. "The trees," she said, pointing to where several pines grew close together, their branches creating a natural canopy. "If we clear the snow beneath and use branches for walls," Dakota assessed her improvised plan with quick, calculating eyes. "It may suffice for the night," he conceded, "but only if we work quickly." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity. Dakota and Samuel gathered fallen branches, while Sarah dug into the snow beneath the trees, creating a hollow large enough for them all. Mrs. Cooper, roused by the urgency in their voices, tore strips from her petticoat to bind the branches together, creating crude but effective windbreaks. The storm descended just as they huddled inside their makeshift shelter, wind howling through the mountains like a living thing. Snow quickly covered the branch roof Sarah had constructed, but rather than collapsing their fragile refuge, it created an insulating layer that trapped their combined body heat. The Cherokee sometimes built such shelters when caught by unexpected weather, Dakota remarked, something like respect warming his tone as he surveyed Sarah's handiwork. you begin to see the land with new eyes. That night, as the others slept fitfully around her, Sarah lay awake, listening to the storm rage overhead. 6 weeks ago, she had been deemed too weak to continue the journey west, too fragile to survive the mountain's challenge. Now she's sheltered within a refuge of her own making, responsible for the lives of those who had once abandoned her. The revelation settled in her chest, not as vindication, but as quiet certainty. Perhaps true strength had never been about conquering the wilderness, but about adapting to it. Not about forcing one's will upon the mountain, but about learning to bend like the pines that now sheltered them, flexible enough to survive the storm, yet never breaking beneath its fury. As dawn approached and the storm's violence gradually subsided, Sarah felt something shift within her. A final shedding of the timid girl who had once accepted others' assessment of her capabilities. In her place stood a woman tested by the mountain and found equal to its challenge. Morning revealed a transformed world, pristine snow stretching in unbroken swaths between islands of pine, the storm having erased all traces of their journey. Sarah emerged from their shelter to find Dakota already surveying the terrain, his expression unreadable. "Can you still find the way to these shelters you spoke of?" she asked, her breath clouding in the crystalline air. "The landmarks remain, though covered," he replied. "But there is a more immediate concern." He gestured toward the horizon, where a thin column of smoke rose against the pale sky. "Others survived the wagon train's attempt to cross." Sarah's heart quickened. "How far?" "Half a day's journey. Less if we were unencumbered." The implication hung between them. Mrs. Cooper could not travel quickly, and the children were already exhausted. Yet fellow survivors might have supplies, medicine, the means to increase all their chances for survival. "Go," Sarah decided. "Find out who remains and what resources they have. We'll follow at Mrs. Cooper's pace." Dakota studied her face with unusual intensity. "You would continue alone?" "I'm not alone," Sarah replied simply, gesturing toward the shelter where the others still slept. "And I'm not the same woman who stood helpless beside a broken wagon axle." A ghost of a smile touched Dakota's lips. "No," he agreed, "you are not." After a brief consultation with Mrs. Cooper, who insisted they should not lose this opportunity for aid, they devised a plan. Dakota would scout ahead to the survivors' camp while Sarah led the others along the clearest path he could mark for them. If all went well, they would reunite by nightfall. As Dakota disappeared into the wintry landscape, Sarah felt a momentary pang of vulnerability. His presence had become their talisman against disaster, his knowledge their shield against the mountain's dangers. Now she stood alone, responsible for 3 lives beyond her own. "Will he come back?" Samuel asked, watching Dakota's retreating figure with worried eyes. "Yes," Sarah answered, with a certainty that surprised even her. "Dakota keeps his promises." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, converting their night's shelter back into a travois for Mrs. Cooper. By mid-morning, they were following Dakota's trail. Broken branches and occasional marks scored into tree trunks, guiding their way through terrain that would otherwise have been impossible to navigate. The day warmed slightly as the sun climbed higher, creating treacherous conditions as snow began to melt and refreeze in patches of ice beneath their feet. Sarah led carefully, testing each step before allowing the children to follow. Their progress was painfully slow, each mile gained representing a significant victory against the mountain's resistance. By early afternoon, exhaustion began to take its toll. Emma stumbled repeatedly, her small face pinched with cold and fatigue. Even Samuel's determined stride had shortened, his shoulders slumping beneath his pack. "We need to rest," Mrs. Cooper called from the travois, her mother's instinct overriding her own discomfort. Sarah found a sheltered hollow between snow-laden rocks and helped the children settle. She distributed the last of their dried meat, watching with concern as the children devoured the meager portions. "You need to eat too," Mrs. Cooper insisted, offering half her share to Sarah. Sarah shook her head. "I'm stronger than I look, remember?" The attempt at humor fell flat, but she maintained her smile. "We'll reach the others by nightfall. There will be food then." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. She had no certainty of what awaited them. Whether Dakota had found friends or foes, abundance or desperation. But the children needed hope to continue, and hope was something Sarah had learned to manufacture from the barest of materials. They resumed their journey after a brief rest, the afternoon sun already beginning its descent behind the western peaks. The temperature dropped perceptibly with each passing hour, the relative warmth of midday surrendering to evening's approaching chill. Sarah had just helped Emma over a particularly difficult section of trail when the sound reached them. Voices, and carried on the wind. Too distant to distinguish words, but unmistakably human. Relief flooded through her, renewing her depleted strength. "We're close," she called back to Mrs. Cooper. "Listen!" They crested a small rise to find themselves looking down into a sheltered valley where several wagons had been arranged in a protective circle. Campfires burned within the enclosure, figures moving around them in the gathering dusk. The sight of this fragile outpost of civilization after weeks of isolation brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. "Pa might be there," Samuel exclaimed, his fatigue forgotten as he surged forward. "Samuel, wait!" Sarah called, but the boy was already scrambling down the slope with reckless speed. Sarah followed as quickly as she dared, helping Emma navigate the steep descent while keeping the travois stable on the uneven ground. By the time they reached level terrain, a group had already emerged from the wagon circle to intercept them, Dakota at their lead. "You made good time," he observed, relief evident beneath his usual reserve. Beside him stood three men Sarah recognized. From the wagon train, Tom Fletcher, a blacksmith from Missouri, Reverend Wilkins, who had conducted brief Sunday services during their journey, and to her shock, the wagon master himself, Ezekiel Harding. The wagon master's eyes widened at the sight of her, his weathered face registering disbelief. "Miss Mitchell, how in God's name?" "She followed a different path," Dakota answered, before Sarah could speak, one that proved wiser than forcing the pass. Harding's expression darkened at the implied criticism, but Reverend Wilkins stepped forward, hands extended in welcome. "A miracle to see you alive, Miss Mitchell, and Mrs. Cooper, too. We feared the worst when we found the wrecked wagons." "James," Mrs. Cooper asked from the travois, her voice thin with hope, despite what Dakota had told them. A heavy silence fell over the group. Reverend Wilkins bowed his head. "I'm sorry, Martha. We found his body 3 days ago when the snow receded briefly near the cliffs." The news, though expected, fell like a physical blow. Samuel stiffened beside Sarah, his small body trembling with emotion. Sarah placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, feeling the exact moment when the last of his childish hope crumbled beneath the weight of confirmed loss. "We'll see to a proper burial when the ground thaws," Reverend Wilkins continued, gently. "For now, we've laid him to rest as best we can." "How many survived?" Sarah asked, forcing practical concerns to override the grief that threatened to engulf them all. 17 souls in all," Fletcher answered. 4 wagons made it through before the snow closed in completely. The rest were abandoned or lost on the attempt. His eyes fell on Dakota. "If not for your friend here, it might have been none. He showed us how to build proper shelters, how to find food when our supplies ran low." "And what of the others in the train?" Mrs. Cooper asked. "Did any turn back before attempting the pass?" The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. 3 families, or chose to winter in the valley rather than push through," Harding admitted reluctantly. "The Millers, the Johnsons, and old Wilkerson with his daughters." The wagons that had remained behind when Sarah was abandoned, the cautious ones who had questioned Harding's judgment even then, a choice that had likely saved their lives while dozens of others perished in the ill-fated crossing attempt. "You should come inside the circle," Reverend Wilkins urged. "There's stew keeping warm, and we've fashioned adequate shelters within the wagons." They moved toward the encampment, Mrs. Cooper's travois now carried by Fletcher and another man who had joined them. As they walked, Harding fell into step beside Sarah, his expression troubled. "I won't ask your forgiveness, Miss Mitchell," he said quietly. "What I did, leaving you behind, it wasn't personal. I truly believed I was saving the majority by sacrificing the few." Sarah studied the wagon master's face, noting the new lines carved around his eyes, the haunted look that hadn't been there before. He had led nearly 50 people into disaster, his certainty in his own judgment proving more dangerous than any storm or mountain pass. "How many died following your path, Mr. Harding?" she asked, her voice carrying no accusation, merely quiet inquiry. He flinched as if she had struck him. 27, he admitted. "Mostly men who tried to clear the way through snowdrifts that kept replenishing faster than we could dig." Sarah nodded, absorbing this confirmation of the catastrophe. "And how many survived following Dakota's path?" Harding's eyes darted to where she had been left for dead, then back to the 4 souls she had helped navigate through impossible terrain. His mouth opened, then closed without response. "Strength isn't always what we think it is," Sarah said, gently. "Sometimes the strongest choice is to change course rather than force the one we've chosen." She moved past him to join the others, leaving Harding standing alone in the gathering darkness. His judgment of her weakness had nearly cost her life. Her judgment of his error had cost 27 others theirs. There was no satisfaction in the comparison, only a profound sadness for what stubborn pride had wrought. Within the wagon circle, Sarah found a community transformed by hardship. The social hierarchies that had defined the wagon train had dissolved. In the face of shared survival, women who had once snubbed her now welcomed her with genuine relief. Men who had dismissed her capabilities now listened intently as she described the shelters they had built during the storm. Dakota remained slightly apart, observing the interactions with watchful eyes. When Sarah finally had a moment to join him at the edge of the gathering, he spoke without preamble. "They cannot stay here," he said quietly. "The food will not last, and the shelters are inadequate for the deep winter that approaches." "What alternative do we have?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "The same one we had before, the Cherokee wintering place. It lies less than 2 days' journey from here, in a valley sheltered from the worst storms. Game is more plentiful there, and natural caves provide better protection than these wagons." Sarah surveyed the makeshift camp with new eyes, seeing its vulnerabilities. The wagons provided psychological comfort, remnants of the civilization they had left behind, but would prove death traps when the truly brutal weather arrived. "They won't want to abandon the wagons," she observed. "Everything they own is here. Then they choose what you once faced, certain death clinging to possessions over possible life-embracing change." The parallel struck Sarah with unexpected force. She had lost everything, father, wagon, belongings, yet found herself more alive than ever before. These survivors clutched the remnants of their former lives, unable to see that such anchors might drag them beneath winter's merciless tide. "They might listen to you," Dakota suggested. "You have walked both paths now." Sarah considered the weight of this responsibility, to convince these people to abandon their last connections to the world they had known, to trust in a new way. Forward, guided by a Cherokee scout, most still viewed with suspicion. "I'll try," she said finally, "but not tonight. Let them have one night of believing they've found safety." Dakota nodded, understanding in his dark eyes. "Tomorrow then, before the next storm comes." As Sarah rejoined the others around the fire, accepting a bowl of thin but nourishing stew, she felt the curious gazes of the survivors upon her. To them, she represented an impossibility, the weak link who had not only survived, but thrived when stronger members had perished. Tomorrow, she would need to convince them that survival lay not in clinging to the familiar, but in embracing the unknown. That the path forward required abandoning not just their wagons, but their very conception of strength itself. For tonight, though, she would simply be grateful for walls that blocked the wind, food that filled empty stomachs, and the knowledge that the most important journey, the one that had transformed her from within, had already been completed. Dawn arrived with disquieting silence. No birdsong, no wind, just the absolute stillness that often preceded nature's most violent outbursts. Sarah woke to find Takoda already outside the wagon circle, his attention fixed on the northwestern horizon where dark clouds gathered like an advancing army. "How long?" she asked, joining him at the perimeter. "By nightfall," he replied. "This one will be worse than the last." Sarah absorbed this knowledge, watching as the camp gradually stirred to life around them. Children emerged from wagons, their faces still hollow from weeks of insufficient food. Women kindled small fires, stretching meager supplies into something resembling breakfast. Men checked and rechecked their weapons, as if guns might somehow defend against the coming storm. "I spoke with the elders during the night," Takoda said quietly. "They resist the idea of leaving the wagons." Elders? Harding, Fletcher, the preacher, those the others looked to for guidance. Sarah studied the camp with fresh eyes, recognizing the power structures that had reasserted themselves. Even here, teetering on survival's edge, they clung to familiar hierarchies. They'll listen to Harding again after what happened. "They have no other story to believe in," Takoda observed, "until someone offers one." The implication hung between them, as clear as the approaching storm front. Sarah felt the weight of expectation settle across her shoulders, but didn't shy away from it. She had earned the right to be heard. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As the camp gathered for morning prayers, a ritual Reverend Wilkins maintained with fierce determination, Harding addressed the assembled survivors. "We've weathered the worst," he declared, surveying the gaunt faces before him. "The wagons provide solid shelter, and come spring, we'll continue to Oregon as planned." "With what oxen?" Fletcher challenged, his blacksmith's pragmatism cutting through false optimism. "Half our animals died in the crossing attempt. The rest grow weaker by the day." "We'll manage," Harding insisted. "We've supplies enough to—" "We don't." Mrs. Cooper's voice carried unexpected authority as she interrupted from where she sat, propped against a wagon wheel, her splintered leg extended before her. "I've helped inventory what remains. Even with strict rationing, we'll be short of food before month's end." Murmurs rippled through the gathered survivors. Harding's face darkened. "Panic serves no purpose, Martha. We'll find game." "The game has moved to lower elevations," Samuel piped up, repeating what Takoda had taught him. The boy flushed as all eyes turned to him but held his ground. "The animals know where to find food when snow covers everything. They're smarter than people that way." A few chuckles broke the tension, but Harding wasn't amused. "The boy doesn't know what he's talking about." "Actually, he does." Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady. "And there's another storm coming. Worse than the last. These wagons won't protect us when it hits." Harding's jaw tightened. "And I suppose you have a better plan, Miss Mitchell? Perhaps another miracle escape like your last?" The barb might once have silenced her, but Sarah had been forged anew by the mountain's challenges. "Not a miracle, Mr. Harding, a different kind of wisdom." She gestured toward Takoda, who stood slightly apart from the gathering. "There's a place 2 days' journey from here. A valley sheltered from the worst storms, with caves for protection and better hunting." "You expect us to trust our lives to an Indian?" someone called from the back. "I expect you to trust someone who knows these mountains," Sarah replied evenly. Someone who found me when you left me for dead and guided me through terrain that claimed 27 of your stronger members. The brutal truth landed like a physical blow. Faces that had been skeptical now grew uncertain, eyes turning toward Harding for reassurance he couldn't provide. "We can't abandon the wagons," Reverend Wilkins protested. "Everything we own will become your coffins if you stay." Dakota spoke for the first time, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent camp. "The storm that comes brings not just snow but ice that will entomb these wagons. You will burn your possessions for warmth until nothing remains, and then you will freeze." His blunt assessment hung in the air, unembellished by false hope or comforting lies. Several women clutched their children closer, men exchanged troubled glances. "We survived the last storm," Harding insisted, though with less conviction. "Because it was not a true winter storm," Dakota countered. "What comes now is the mountain's real fury." Fletcher rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "How would we transport Martha Cooper with her broken leg? And the children? Some are already weak from hunger." "The same way we traveled here," Sarah answered. "We build travois for those who cannot walk. We carry what food remains, essential tools, weapons, everything else stays behind." "You're asking us to give up everything," a woman cried, clutching a small wooden box to her chest, probably containing family heirlooms or mementos from a life left behind. Sarah approached her gently. "I'm asking you to distinguish between what can be replaced and what cannot." She gestured toward the small boy clinging to the woman's skirts. "His life can't be replaced, nor can yours." "And if we refuse this madness," Harding challenged, making a final stand as his authority visibly crumbled, "if we choose to stay with our possessions, then I will wish you Godspeed and a merciful end," Sarah replied without anger. "But I won't stay to watch it happen, and neither will I leave the children to face it." Her words landed with unexpected force. Parents looked at their children, then at the looming storm clouds, weighing intangible possessions against living futures. Rebecca Wilkerson, a middle-aged widow traveling with teenage daughters, stepped forward. "I'll go with Miss Mitchell and the Cherokee. My girls and I survived because we didn't follow you through the pass, Mr. Harding. I'm inclined to trust those who've been right before." Others began to nod in agreement, first hesitantly, then with growing conviction. Even Fletcher, initially skeptical, ultimately threw his support behind the plan. "We can always build new wagons come spring," he reasoned. "Can't replace people." By mid-morning, only Harding and a few staunch allies remained opposed. The wagon master watched with barely concealed fury as the camp transformed into purposeful activity. Supplies distributed according to what each person could carry, travois constructed for Mrs. Cooper and the weakest children, weapons cleaned and readied. Sarah supervised the preparations, assigning tasks based on each person's capabilities rather than traditional roles. Women who had never handled tools now helped Fletcher fashion carrying frames from wagon parts. Men unaccustomed to domestic work sorted food supplies under Martha Cooper's direction. "You've taken my train from me," Harding accused, confronting Sarah as she helped load a small travois. "Turn them against everything I've stood for." Sarah straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I've offered them a choice you didn't. Give me, Mr. Harding, the freedom to choose survival over pride. And if they die following your path instead of mine—" The question gave her pause, not because she doubted their course, but because she recognized the fear beneath his anger. Harding's identity had been built around being the man who knew best, who made the hard decisions others couldn't. Her challenge to that authority struck at the core of who he believed himself to be. "Then I will bear that responsibility," she answered quietly, "as you bear yours for those already lost." Something shifted in Harding's expression. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps the first fracture in his certainty. He turned away without another word, returning to the small group still determined to remain with the wagons. By early afternoon, dark clouds had swallowed the western peaks, and the first exploratory gusts of wind swept through the camp. The 17 who had chosen to follow Sarah and Dakota gathered at the eastern edge of the wagon circle. 14. Adults, including Sarah and 3 children. Those staying behind, Harding and 4 others, stood apart, their faces set in stony determination. No farewells were exchanged between the groups, the divide between their philosophies too profound for empty pleasantries. Dakota approached Sarah as final preparations were completed. "The storm advances faster than I anticipated. We must move. Now to reach suitable shelter before nightfall." Sarah nodded, surveying their unlikely caravan. A blacksmith leading 2 travois, a reverend carrying more weight than seemed possible for his slight frame. Women with rifle straps crossing their chests, children bearing small packs sized for their capabilities. "We're ready," she said, and realized she meant it in ways that extended far beyond this moment. They were ready not just for this journey, but for the new understanding of survival it represented, one that valued adaptation over domination, cooperation over hierarchy. As they departed the wagon circle, Sarah felt Harding's eyes following her. She turned back once, meeting his gaze across the growing distance. No words were necessary. They both understood what this division represented, not just 2 paths through the mountains, but 2 philosophies of existence. The wind grew stronger as they ascended a gentle slope, leading away from the camp, forcing them to lean into its resistance. The children struggled against its force until Fletcher devised a system of ropes connecting everyone together, allowing the stronger to literally pull the weaker forward. "Dakota!" Sarah called, fighting to make her voice heard above the mounting gale. "How far to the first shelter you mentioned?" 3 miles, he replied, "but in these conditions it will feel like 10. He spoke truth. What might have been an hour's journey in calm weather became an epic struggle against nature's gathering fury. The wind drove ice crystals against any exposed skin, each breath becoming more labored as the temperature plummeted. Emma Cooper stumbled repeatedly until Sarah hoisted the exhausted child onto her back, ignoring the burning protest of her own muscles. Samuel took his sister's place in the line, his small face set with the determination of someone far beyond his years. The first flakes of snow began to fall, not the gentle descent of previous storms, but horizontal projectiles driven by the shrieking wind. Visibility diminished with alarming speed until Sarah could barely see Dakota at the head of their line, just 15 feet ahead. "There!" His voice carried back to her as he pointed toward what appeared to be merely another snow-covered slope. Only as they drew closer did Sarah discern the darkness of an opening, a cave entrance, partially concealed by an overhanging ridge. They staggered inside, collapsing onto the packed earth floor as the storm's full fury erupted outside. The contrast between the cave's sheltered stillness and the chaos beyond its entrance was so profound that several of them wept with relief. "The wagons," Rebecca Wilkerson whispered, her face pale with realization. "They'll never survive this." Sarah remembered Harding's stubborn determination, his refusal to admit error even when confronted with undeniable evidence. "They made their choice," she said quietly, "as we made ours." Dakota moved among them, organizing their shelter with practiced efficiency, positioning the weakest, nearest to where a fire would be built, arranging their supplies to create windbreaks against drafts from the cave entrance. As darkness fell, outside, transforming the storm into an invisible force identifiable only by its howling voice, Sarah joined Dakota near the cave mouth. Together they watched ice forming along the entrance, nature's architecture growing more elaborate with each passing minute. "We made the right choice," she said, needing to voice the thought aloud. Dakota studied her face in the dim light. "You knew it was right when you made it. You seek confirmation only because you wish those who stayed behind had made the same choice." His insight struck uncomfortably close to truth. Sarah had led these people to safety, yet couldn't escape the knowledge that others remained in danger because of their own stubborn pride, the same pride she had once mistaken for strength. "Can any of them survive this?" she asked. "Perhaps," Dakota replied, his honesty unflinching, "if they burn the wagons for warmth and the storm passes quickly. But the winter has only begun. What comes after will claim them if this does not." Outside, the storm's voice rose to a fevered pitch, wind shrieking through the mountain passes like a living entity. Inside their stone sanctuary, Fletcher succeeded in kindling a small fire, its warmth and light creating a circle of comfort that felt miraculous after the day's ordeal. As the others gathered around the flames, sharing what food they had brought and settling children for the night, Sarah remained at the entrance with Dakota, watching ice crystals build their intricate lacework across the opening. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "We continue if the storm breaks. If not, we remain here another day." The Cherokee wintering place lies less than a day's journey beyond, but only if the weather permits safe passage. Sarah nodded, mentally calculating their supplies against possible delays. "We'll make it," she said with quiet certainty. Dakota's eyes caught the distant firelight, reflecting amber warmth in their depths. "Yes," he agreed, "you will." Something in his emphasis made Sarah turn to study his face. "You say that as if I will guide you to the wintering place," he said, "but I cannot remain there. My duties to the fort require my return once you are safely established." The revelation shouldn't have surprised her. Dakota had never promised to remain with them beyond ensuring their survival. Yet Sarah felt an unexpected hollowness at the thought of continuing without his guidance. "We've learned much from you," she said carefully, "but there's still so much we don't know about surviving here." "You know more than you realize," Dakota replied. "You have already made the most important discovery." "Which is?" His gesture encompassed the cave. The people gathered around the fire, the storm raging impotently outside their sanctuary. That survival requires not conquest, but adaptation, not forcing your will upon the mountain, but learning to bend with its demands while maintaining your essential self. The wisdom resonated deep within Sarah, articulating what she had sensed, but not fully grasped. Their journey had never been merely about physical endurance, but about a fundamental shift in how they perceived their relationship with the world around them. "Will we see you again?" she asked, unable to keep the question contained. Dakota's expression remained unreadable, yet something in his eyes suggested her question had touched him unexpectedly. "The winter is long," he said finally, "and those who survive it often find their paths crossing again when spring returns to the mountains." It wasn't a promise, yet Sarah found herself accepting it as one, not because she needed false hope, but because she had learned to recognize truth in what remained unspoken. Just as she had learned to read the mountain's warnings in subtle signs, she now understood that Dakota's response carried more meaning than his words alone conveyed. Beyond the cave entrance, the storm continued its relentless assault, battering the mountainside with elemental fury. Yet within their stone shelter, 17 souls who had chosen a different kind of strength rested in relative safety. Not because they had conquered nature's challenge, but because they had finally learned to yield to its wisdom without surrendering. Their will to survive. As Sarah finally joined the others around the fire, accepting a small portion of their carefully rationed meal, she caught Samuel Cooper watching her with solemn eyes that held wisdom far beyond his years. "We're going to be all right, aren't we, Miss Sarah?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question with the honesty the boy deserved. "Not because we're stronger than the mountain," she answered, "but because we've finally learned what kind of strength actually matters." Samuel nodded, satisfaction in his expression. That's what Pa never understood. He always thought being strong meant never changing your mind. From the wisdom of a child came the epitaph for those who had chosen to remain behind, men who had confused rigidity with strength, dominance with survival. Sarah placed her hand gently on Samuel's shoulder, feeling the resilience in his slight frame. "Tomorrow we continue," she said, loud enough for all to hear. "And tomorrow we prove there's more than one kind of strength in this world." Outside, the storm raged on. But within their sanctuary, a new kind of certainty had taken root, not the brittle confidence of those who believed they could bend nature to their will, but the supple assurance of those who had learned to bend without breaking. The proposition carried implications that extended far beyond meeting a bureaucratic threshold. What Dakota proposed was unprecedented, not merely neighboring settlements of different peoples, but a single community of shared purpose and governance. The others would need to agree, Sarah said carefully, her mind racing through potential reactions. Fletcher, the Wilkersons, the Coopers. They have already faced the choice between clinging to old ways or embracing new possibilities, Dakota observed. This would simply be another such choice. Sarah thought of Samuel Cooper's quick adaptation to Dakota's teachings, of Rebecca Wilkerson's fierce defense of the new roles her daughters had assumed in their community, of Fletcher's pragmatic respect for useful skills regardless of their source. "I believe they would welcome the arrangement," she said with growing confidence. "But what of the army, the territory representatives? Would they recognize such a settlement?" Lieutenant Harrington understands the advantage of peaceful cooperation between settlers and native peoples. The territory officials care only for the number, not the composition. A hint of irony colored Dakota's tone. "Your government's forms do not ask about skin color or origin, only the count of adults establishing the claim." The sheer audacity of the plan struck Sarah suddenly, prompting unexpected laughter. "We would be using their own rules to create something they never intended, as they have often used ours," Dakota replied, though without bitterness. "The difference is in the purpose, not to take from others, but to build together." A question that had hovered unspoken between them throughout the winter suddenly crystallized in Sarah's mind. "And you? Would you be among those settling here?" Dakota's gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon, where the first stars had begun to appear. "My duties to the fort cannot be abandoned immediately, but they grow less necessary as peace between peoples becomes more established." It wasn't the direct answer Sarah had hoped for, yet she heard in it the same measured consideration he gave to all important matters. Dakota would not make promises lightly, nor commit to paths he could not honorably follow. "In time," he added, his voice softening slightly, "I have seen that a man might serve as bridge between worlds while still having a place to call home." The implication settled in Sarah's heart with quiet certainty. Not a promise of immediate presence, but of eventual belonging, which she realized was how all genuine connections must begin. "I'll speak with the others at first light," she decided, "before the territory representatives begin formal registrations." 3 days later, as Dakota had predicted, 7 Cherokee adults and 4 children arrived at the valley's eastern entrance. They came without fanfare, their possessions carried on travois or packed in parfleche bags, practical, mobile, yet containing all they needed to establish new lives. Sarah stood with Fletcher, Rebecca Wilkerson, and the others who had chosen to remain, watching as Dakota stepped forward to make introductions in both Cherokee and English. The newcomers' faces showed the same wariness any people might display when venturing into uncertain welcome, yet their posture held dignity rather than supplication. Rising Wolf, an elder with silver-streaked hair and penetrating gaze, spoke for the Cherokee group. "We seek not charity, but partnership," he declared, his heavily accented English nevertheless conveying clear intent. "We bring knowledge of these mountains that goes back generations. We offer this freely if we may build alongside you as equals." Fletcher, who had initially shown the most reservation about the arrangement, stepped forward with hand extended. "We survived our first winter here only because Takoda showed us how," he said bluntly. "Seems foolish to reject more of the same wisdom." One by one, the settlers welcomed the newcomers, curiosity gradually overcoming initial awkwardness. Children, as always, bridged divides most easily. Samuel and Emma Cooper soon leading the Cherokee children on a tour of their valley home, communication succeeding despite language differences. Lieutenant Harrington observed the integration with carefully neutral expression, though Sarah caught the slight nod he exchanged with Takoda. The territory representatives reacted with varying degrees of dismay and resignation, but ultimately recorded 16 settler adults and 7 Cherokee adults on their official registry, 23 in total, well above the required minimum. This settlement will be noted in territorial records as... Mrs. Abernathy paused, pen hovering above her form. "Harmony Valley," Sarah suggested, looking to both Fletcher and Rising Wolf for approval. Both nodded, finding in the simple name an expression of their unprecedented experiment. As spring advanced into early summer, those departing for Oregon completed their preparations. New wagons constructed under Fletcher's direction stood ready, loaded with the revitalized community's gifts: smoked meat, tanned hides, medicinal plants prepared by the Cherokee women. On the morning of departure, Sarah stood with Reverend Wilkins at the valley's western entrance, their previous differences set aside in mutual respect. "I still believe Oregon offers advantages we may never have here," Wilkins admitted, watching as the final supplies were loaded. "And I believe we're creating something here that Oregon, for all its advantages, has yet to achieve," Sarah replied. Without judgment, the Reverend studied her face thoughtfully. "You've changed, Miss Mitchell. When we first met on the trail, you were..." "Defined by others' expectations," Sarah finished for him. "As we all were in different ways." "And now?" Sarah gazed beyond him to where Cherokee and settler women worked side by side, preparing travel rations, where Fletcher demonstrated ironworking techniques to an attentive Rising Wolf, where children of both peoples played without awareness of the boundaries adults had constructed between their worlds. "Now we define ourselves," she said simply, "by what we build rather than what we fear." The wagon train departed with promises of correspondence once they reached Oregon. Sarah watched until the last canvas top disappeared beyond the western ridge, then turned back to the tasks awaiting her in their evolving settlement. Summer passed. In a blur of constant activity, fields planted and tended, permanent structures raised, knowledge exchanged between peoples who discovered their differences less significant than their shared purpose. The Cherokee taught techniques for preserving food and medicines. The settlers contributed iron tools and mechanical knowledge that benefited all. Takoda came and went throughout these months, his arrivals greeted with increasing warmth by all community members, though Sarah sensed his gaze found her first upon each return. Their connection remained unspoken, yet deepening, built on shared understanding and mutual respect rather than conventional courtship. Autumn painted the valley. In brilliant hues of red and gold, the abundant harvest safely stored in root cellars dug into the hillsides. As the first light snow dusted the highest peaks, the community gathered to celebrate their achievements, a feast combining traditions from both cultures, creating something entirely new in the process. Sarah stood slightly apart from the celebration, watching as Cherokee drums accompanied a Virginia reel, as Rising Wolf's grandson taught Samuel Cooper to use a blowgun, as Rebecca Wilkerson's daughters demonstrated their newly learned basket-weaving skills to admiring Cherokee women. "You have created something remarkable," Dakota's voice came from behind her, his approach silent as always. "We have," Sarah corrected, turning to face him. "All of us together." Dakota's winter assignment had been confirmed. He would remain in the valley as the fort's official liaison to both the settlement and surrounding tribes, a position that recognized his unique ability to bridge different worlds. "When I found you beside that broken wagon," he said quietly, "I saw something others had missed, a different kind of strength, one that bends without breaking, that adapts without surrendering its essence. You taught me to recognize that strength in myself," Sarah acknowledged, "and now, together, we've taught others to value it as well." Dakota's hand found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own work-roughened ones. "The wagon master was wrong about many things," he said, "but perhaps most wrong in how he measured human worth." Sarah thought of Harding, of the wagon train, of the long journey that had led her not to Oregon, but to this unexpected place of belonging. "He saw me as too weak to continue the journey west," she mused. "He never understood that strength isn't always about the path you force yourself to follow, but sometimes about the new path you have the courage to create." As they rejoined the celebration, Samuel Cooper broke away from his friends to approach. Sarah, with the direct gaze of a boy, fast becoming a young man. "Pa used to say women weren't made for frontier life," he said without preamble, "that they weren't strong enough for what needed doing." Sarah waited, hearing in the boy's words not criticism but the prelude to his own realization. "But he was wrong, wasn't he?" Samuel continued, his eyes tracking the confident movements of the women, both settler and Cherokee, who had built this community alongside the men. "There's different kinds of strong." "Yes," Sarah agreed, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder. "And the wisest among us learn to recognize strength in all its forms." As the evening celebration continued around them, Sarah and Dakota walked to the valley's edge, where they had first stood nearly a year before. Below them spread the settlement they had helped create, not merely a place of survival, but of genuine thriving, where different peoples had found common purpose in shared humanity. "The winter approaches again," Dakota observed, his gaze taking in the darkening sky where the first stars had begun to appear. "Yes," Sarah agreed, but without the fear such observation might once have triggered. "And this time, we're ready for it." She did not specify whether she meant the physical preparations they had made or the deeper readiness they had all developed, the knowledge that true strength often looked nothing like its conventional definition, that survival sometimes required surrender rather than resistance, that community rather than individual might was what ultimately ensured continuance. Dakota seemed to understand all she left unspoken, his hand finding hers again, with the easy familiarity of those who had traveled difficult paths together and emerged changed, but unbroken. "This valley has sheltered many over generations," he said quietly, "but perhaps never before has it witnessed such a transformation of spirits within a single turning of seasons." Sarah thought of the woman she had been when the wagon master pronounced her too weak to continue, accepting of others' definitions, desperate to fulfill her father's dreams rather than discovering her own. That woman seemed now like a half-formed sketch compared to the fully realized person she had become. "We all contain more possibilities than others see in us," she replied. "Sometimes we need the right circumstances or the right guide to reveal them." As they returned to the fireside, where their unprecedented community celebrated its collective achievements, Sarah felt a bone-deep certainty that the wagon master's greatest error hadn't been abandoning her to fate, but failing to recognize that genuine strength often wore disguises invisible to those who understood only one definition of power. The so-called weak girl left behind had not only survived, but had helped forge something entirely new, a community built on shared wisdom rather than dominance, on adaptation rather than conquest. In doing so, She had not merely proven her individual worth, but had demonstrated a different model of strength itself, one that might in time transform the very frontier that had nearly claimed her life. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.